All right, welcome. This week we're discussing Midsummer Night's Dream, um, Acts 1 through 2. And we're going to be focusing on fairies and the folklore around fairies. First, of course, always a little textual introduction. So this play, it's not exactly known when this play was written. It's believed to have been written between 1594 and 1596, which would place it right around the time of Romeo and Juliet. So we are not 100% sure which play came first. We don't know if Romeo and Juliet came first or if A Midsummer Night's Dream came first. But it's interesting to think about these two plays being written close together. Um, for reasons that we will talk about next week, become more clear when we get to the play within a play scene. Now, A Midsummer Night's Dream wasn't published or printed until the year 1600. It was printed in a quarto format, and this first quarto is usually considered very authoritative and used as the source text for many editions. There is also an edition of A Midsummer Night's Dream in the folio, the 1623 folio, that has a lot of mostly small changes, a few that are interesting. Most of the changes involve different characters speaking different lines or different parts, so assigning different speeches to different characters, which is interesting in some cases, but otherwise most of the changes are fairly small between them. So, from the beginning, this play was widely beloved. It's been a favorite Shakespeare play basically since it was written. It's perennially popular with audiences, and I will personally admit this is probably my favorite Shakespeare play. I just never get tired of seeing this one performed, or of rereading it over again, or of writing about it in my research. I just can't get tired of this play. And I think a lot of it has to do, at least for me, with the magical world of the fairies that Shakespeare sets up here. So let's do a little historical context on fairies to understand just how interesting and potentially revolutionary Shakespeare's portrayal of fairies is in this play. So historically, fairies were viewed as very dangerous beings, or at least incredibly mischievous and delighting in causing chaos. So they were creatures that needed to be warded against, that needed to be protected against, and that were seen as malicious towards humans. So now, belief in fairies in England specifically, I mean, belief in fairies has existed throughout Europe, and potentially even other parts of the world. But in England, it's the belief in fairies dates back to pre-recorded uh, legend. Fairies often show up in many Arthurian legends. But again, those fairies were often evil or dangerous or witchy. So take, for instance, Morgan Le Fay. So she's considered a witch, but her name, Morgan of the Fay, Le Fay, connects her to a fairy realm, a fay realm. That's etymologically connected. And there are other fairies that pop up in various Arthur stories, and 90% of the time, maybe even 100% of the time, they are going to be sort of evil, or if not outright evil, just not very caring of the humans they interact with. So fairies and fairy stories are often believed to be holdovers of England's pagan past. So potentially the remnants of gods or spirits that the ancient pagan tribes believed in and worshipped. But fairies hung around after the introduction of Christianity, and there's some very interesting sermons from the time that talk about that are like pastors or religious leaders trying to explain their congregants' belief in fairies, um, and Christianity explained fairies away as being creatures of the devil, as being demonic spirits, evil spirits, and so you'll see here this is a piece of stained glass showing some demonic fairy creatures. So fairy belief still sort of existed well into Christian times. Um, simply uh, moving fairies from a pagan realm to Christian evil demonic realm. In fact, fairies are even mentioned in, if you remember, we talked a couple weeks ago about King James's book Demonology, where he talks all about witchcraft and all the different types of witchcraft, and he actually mentions fairies in that book as being, I can't remember if it's in that book or somewhere else, where they talk about fairies potentially being familiar spirits to witches. So anyway, fairies were evil. Um, and fairies were traditionally feared for a few specific reasons. They were often blamed for mysterious pregnancies. If the maid or farmer's daughter or whoever found herself pregnant unexpectedly, she could sometimes claim it was a fairy spirit that had visited her in the night. Um, More common, however, was the fear of the changeling, and that's what this picture is sort of illustrating here. The legends of changelings are super interesting. Um, Very, I don't know, they feel bizarre from a modern standpoint, but it's this idea that fairies wanted human babies for all sorts of various purposes, be it sacrifice or be it um, just to raise them in the Fey realm or something. So there was this fear that fairies would come and either outright steal the babies away, just take them, or replace them with sort of, you see, some sort of devil creature child. So maybe this was a way of explaining bad children or naughty children or something. This idea of changelings. Um, it's a really interesting folklore, and one of the main reasons that fairies were feared. They were feared. It was feared that fairies would come in and steal babies, steal the children. Um, Fairies were also very often blamed for smaller or small domestic catastrophes, um, such as food spoiling or milk cows drying up or pets dying or any other sorts of small domestic mishaps. Um, so here we see some fairies stealing apples out of the storage, or this fairy walking off with the goose or something, right? So fairies were often blamed for those small domestic tragedies, and so people believed that they needed to ward against fairies, that they needed to placate them sometimes or somehow. So offerings were often left out to fairies, fairy uh, food or meals or gifts were left for fairies. Um, or there were fairy paths that they were considered to be fairy paths, and they were guarded. Houses had to be built around fairy paths sometimes. Or certain areas of the woods would be off limits because they would be considered fairy realms, and you wouldn't go into those portions of the wood. Um, so we saw in Macbeth a sort of representation of evil magic, right, with the three witches. We already talked about how fairies were, very much associated with witches, um, and with that sort of evilness, um, and this sort of evil realm. Now, there are two or three things that we know about, that were general characteristics of fairies, of sort of this original belief in fairies. First, the fairy realm, as was the witch realm, honestly, um, was a highly feminized realm. Okay, it was the realm of women. Okay, witches were almost always women. Now there were occasionally warlocks or wizards, male wizards, occasionally, but sort of also in the fairy realm, fairies were more often female, with a few popular male fairy characters that we'll talk about in a minute. But along with the fairies and witches themselves usually being women, um, the stories told about fairies and about witches were told by women. So fairy tales that get passed down, get passed along, they were told by women, shared around the family fireplace or whatever. But they were considered women's stories. Women were the one who kept up the superstitions of fairies. Women were the ones who, were making the offerings to the fairies. Um, so much about the realm of this sort of darker magic or these darker spirits was considered feminized, a female sort of superstition and a female sort of magic. Um, Second thing, both witches and fairies, as we can see here, were highly associated with nature. Okay, um, so there's several reasons for this, and more than we can go into. Um, First is that maybe harkens back to original pagan um, beliefs and pagan powers that were assumed to come from the natural world. Um, but also it just has to do with where, the fairies were assumed to have lived in the forest. The forest is a natural realm, an untamed realm, a wild realm, uh, going along with being a female realm, untamed and wild. Um, And if you remember, especially when we're talking about witches were usually just women who happened to know a lot about herbs and plants and nature in general. Um, and that sort of natural power, that sort of natural world, was seen as magic, a green world of magic. So it is a feminized sphere and a natural world, or a natural sphere, that is sort of outside the realm of male civilization, outside the realm of male hierarchy. And therefore, it's considered an evil realm, an evil sphere with the intent to harm man. But now, let's think about the fairies that actually show up in A Midsummer Night's Dream. So, unlike the witches in Macbeth, the fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream do not seem to be representing an outright evil or malicious or dangerous magic. Yes, there's some mischief and some chaos, which is very typical of fairy magic. Um, but it's interesting that these fairies actually seem downright caring of humans. So, as one piece of evidence for this, this is Titania's speech that she gives Oberon right after they've met up. This is Act 2, Scene 1. So Titania and Oberon have met up, and it's become clear from their dialogue that they have been kind of fighting each other. Oberon's been unfaithful, Titania's potentially been unfaithful, they're throwing accusations at each other, they're fighting over this Indian boy, considered a changeling. We'll talk about that in just a second. Anyway, so they haven't been getting along, um, which means they haven't been meeting up to have their usual uh, dances or orgies or whatever it is. They haven't been meeting up for that, and there's been some magical and natural world consequences of this falling out in their relationship. And so Titania is talking about all these things. Um, ever since we started fighting, all of these problems have been happening. Okay, the winds aren't working the way they should. Um, they're sucking up from the sea. Contagious fogs are falling over the land. Um, Rivers are flooding. The ox is not working. Plowman has lost his sweat. Green corn has rotted. Um, Fold stands empty in the drowned field. Crows are fatted, and anyway, so just like all of these problems are plaguing the natural world, and it's affecting humans. And look, you can see she's really concerned for humans. The human mortals want their winter cheer. No night is now with him or Carol blessed. Um, so, like bad things are still happening, and the humans are suffering, and she's worried. She's worried about this human suffering. So she's mourning all of the chaos that their broken relationship has caused people. Okay, now to go back to the changeling story, I didn't post any of these excerpts, but just to talk about it for a second, um, the the changeling story that Titania tells is that she and the mother of this boy were really good friends. The mother was a votaress. Um, that is just one of her acolytes, one of her worshippers, one of Titania's worshippers. Um, and the mother died in childbirth, leaving the baby an orphan. And so Titania takes the baby, vowing to raise it as her own in honor of her friend, her human friend. So that's a twist on the changeling story. This was not a stolen baby. This was not a maliciously taken baby taken away from its parents. Um, this is actually Titania taking pity on an orphan child and doing a service to her mortal human friend by raising her boy. So, there's a twist on the fairy story that makes the fairies seem so much more humane, so much more kind and gentle towards humans, so much more concerned about humans. And then, also, I didn't post this scene either, but in that final scene of Act 2, we see Oberon overhearing Helena and Demetrius's conversation, where Helena is just pouring her heart out to Demetrius, and Demetrius keeps shutting her down and go away, and I don't want to see your face, and I'm gonna run it. So Demetrius is treating Helena really poorly, and Oberon feels sympathy for her and decides to help Helena out. Um, so so anyway, um, all of these stereotypes are being broken here, and that these fairies do not seem malicious at all towards humans. In fact, they seem to care quite a bit about humans and be conscious of the way that their fairy power is affecting humans. Um, so that's one way that these fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream are not typical of the traditional fairies of medieval and early modern folklore. And the second stereotype that seems to be broken here in Shakespeare's play, and we could debate this. We could actually spend a lot of time debating this because there's arguments on either side. But some people like to argue how this fairy realm in A Midsummer Night's Dream is not a fully feminized fairy realm. By that, there's a male court and a female court, right? We have King Oberon and Queen Titania. Now, the idea of this king, a fairy king, um, is a little bit new to fairy folklore. There's been an idea of a fairy queen. I mean, have you heard of Spenser's The Fairy Queen in the title? That's more allegorical and actually referring to Queen Elizabeth. But in fairy folklore, there'd been a long tradition of a fairy queen, right, and her feminized fairy court. But in this play, he essentially makes up a fairy king, Oberon. Now, he does draw a little bit from folklore. Oberon, I think from the sources I looked at, they think he came from a German legend, um, but in that legend, Oberon was a dwarf or an elf or somewhere in between there. Anyway, but Shakespeare turns him into a fairy and turns him into a king. So he gives the fairies a king. And I'm not going to categorically say, because I'm not an expert on this, if this is the first time ever that we have a fairy king, but it's definitely one of the biggest examples ever of a fairy king, along with a fairy queen. And so many people like to make the argument that this fairy world, this fairy society, seems very patriarchal. The way Oberon treats Titania, uh, is, I mean, we'll see as we go throughout the play, it's fairly patriarchal, for sure. And people make this argument that the fairy world then is structured just like the human world in Athens, with the court of Theseus, and that there's this measure of masculine civilization operating over this fairy world. Um, so this is something we can continue to debate. Uh, the masculine influence of having a fairy king and what that does to the fairy world, because there is still one stereotype that isn't necessarily overturned at all, and that is the fact that these fairies in A Midsummer Night's Dream are still very much of nature, right? Um, there is still very much a divide between that civilized world of Athens with Theseus and that sort of civilized structure, and the woods, the woods where these fairies dwell. Um, and this forest is still very much a, uh, a place of magic, a place of mystery, a place of mischief. We haven't seen all the mischief yet, but if you don't know the story yet, just wait. The next few acts, lots and lots of mischief is going to happen in these woods. We get natural magic with the flower. We've already heard the flower mentioned, so herbal magic going on. Anyway, so this fairy world, this forest world, is still very much a realm away from that civilized world of Athens, a realm where the characters enter into this no man's land, this dream place of the forest, with fairies and magic and madness and mischief and all sorts of crazy, interesting, beautiful, wonderful, scary, terrifying things going on. So that potential paganness, or just maybe pagan's not the right word, but just this natural wildness is still very much a part of this fairy culture that Shakespeare has created. So it might be too much to say that Shakespeare invented the friendly fairy. Um, that's probably too strong of a statement. Um, there was probably, especially towards this early modern period, just a general shift happening in an attitude towards fairies as far as a nostalgia. There was this idea, and it's an idea that's been around forever. This idea in the early modern period, this idea that the people of the past, so the people of the Middle Ages, the people that came before, believed in fairies, um, and that this new early modern England had sort of moved beyond that belief in fairies. And so even if some people in the country sort of still practiced a belief a little bit, it was more of a nostalgic feel of looking back fondly on this idea of green magic, on this idea of a magical world that might exist in our forests or in our country areas. Um, and with that nostalgia comes a kinder view of what fairies could be, right? So this has happened to witches a little bit, maybe not in the early modern period, but today now we tend to have a kinder or at least a nostalgic view of witchcraft. Um, I don't want to bring up Harry Potter again, but right there it is. We have a belief in good witches now. Um, Along with the evil witches. But that's sort of where fairy opinion, fairy folklore was headed, to this idea of good fairies, kind fairies. And so I don't want to say that Shakespeare invented the good fairy or the kind fairy or that beautifully magic fairy, but this play has certainly had an outsized influence on how we conceive of fairies. Especially, say, the 19th century Victorians loved this play so much, and they loved the idea of magical fairies so much. This painting here comes from the 19th century, and it's just this image now of how we view fairies, still highly feminized, so that they're beautiful, they're natural, and we view them as kind and benevolent and um, uh, creatures that we're drawn towards, okay? Not necessarily creatures that we fear anymore. Um, Although a little bit of danger will always exist in the background of fairy magic, a little bit of wildness. Um, anyway, so those are things to continue thinking about how this fairy world is working in concert with popular culture, with folklore and witches, and how Shakespeare is sort of changing the narrative of what fairies are, what fairy magic is, how the fairy realm works. Is it still a feminized space? Is it still a wild space? Is it more masculine? Is it more civilized? Um, and how do we feel about this kind of magic, right? Good magic or bad magic, beautiful fairies or scary fairies, something to be avoided and warded against, or something to be sought and looked for. Anyway, I just hope you enjoy the fairy scenes and think through some of these questions, and we'll be back next week with so much more to talk about with this play. Oh, so much more to talk about. But we'll see you then.